Olá, pessoal! Tudo bem? Sejam muito bem-vindos ao canal Inglês de Verdade. Hoje você vai encarar um desafio rápido, mas super poderoso para turbinar o seu inglês. Você vai ouvir um mini podcast em inglês e logo depois responder 5 perguntas que vão testar de verdade a sua compreensão do que foi dito. Esse exercício é perfeito para você que quer melhorar o listening, aprender novas palavras e, claro, aumentar sua confiança no inglês. Ah, e se quiser uma ajudinha extra, é só ativar a legenda em inglês que está disponível aí no vídeo. Preparado? Então bora começar!
Let's start this deep dive with a pretty jarring thought experiment.
Yeah.
Just for you listening right now. Imagine waking up one morning and finding out that New York, London, Tokyo, they're all just gone.
And not slowly abandoned over centuries.
No, not at all. Just wiped out. The entire city, all its knowledge, its power gone within a single generation.
Which is a terrifying thought. And it
That-
feels impossible, right? We think our systems, our global connections are just too stable for that.
But that exact kind of catastrophic failure actually happened. It's one of history's biggest mysteries. The collapse of the Bronze Age, right around 1200 BCE. We're talking about entire kingdoms, advanced, powerful, literate societies that just vanished.
And that's really our mission for this deep dive, to unpack this event, the Bronze Age collapse, and try to understand how an entire world system could fail so completely.
People call it the first globalized world, and
Yep.
that's not really an exaggeration, is it?
No, it's not. You have these massive interconnected powers, the New Kingdom of Egypt, the Hittite Empire in what's now Turkey, the Mycenaeans in Greece.
And they were all trading, all communicating.
Deeply. The kings would actually call each other brother in their letters. There was a shared diplomatic language, royal marriages. It was a very sophisticated international club.
And the logistics were just, well, mind-boggling. This was the Bronze Age, so everything depended on bronze.
Right, which is an alloy. You need copper, which they got from Cyprus, but you also need tin.
And the tin had to come from where?
Unbelievably far away, sometimes as far as modern Afghanistan. So you have these huge, complex supply chains stretching across the entire known world.
It was a world of palaces and chariots and incredible wealth. And for centuries, this system worked,
It worked brilliantly. It was the absolute peak of its time.
which makes the speed of its collapse so shocking. This world didn't just fade away sometime between 1200 and 1150 BCE, so about 50 years.
A single lifetime, really.
The whole thing just imploded.
And the evidence we have for that is just harrowing. There's this one example from the ruins of Ugat, a rich port city on the Syrian coast. Archaeologists found a clay letter, basically sitting in a kiln, ready to be fired and sent. It never left.
What did it say?
It's from the king, and you can almost feel the panic. He writes, "The enemy ships are already here. Our city's burned. Send help quickly." And then the last line is just chilling, but there is no one left.
So the city was destroyed before the messenger could even leave.
Exactly. The end came that fast.
And that wasn't just a one-off event. That was happening everywhere.
Everywhere. The entire Hittite Empire. Gone. Just vanished.
The Mycenaean kingdoms in Greece, the world of Achilles and Agamemnon.
All destroyed. Their palaces burned. Egypt barely survived. It fought off huge invasions, but was so weakened it never really recovered its former glory.
So when the king of Ugarit was calling for help from his brothers,
There was no one to answer the call. His brothers were fighting for their own survival or were already gone. It was a complete system-wide failure, a domino effect.
which brings us to the big question, the central mystery. Why? How could it all fall apart at the same time?
Well, historians are pretty much in agreement that there's no single silver bullet here. No one cause.
It was a perfect storm.
That's the best way to put it. We're looking at maybe 5 huge problems all hitting these societies at once, creating this cascade of failures.
Okay, so let's break them down. What's theory number 1?
Theory 1 is the most dramatic. It sounds like something out of a movie. The mysterious sea peoples.
Right, I've heard of them. Egyptian records talk about them, don't they?
They do. Pharaohs carved these massive inscriptions about fighting off terrifying waves of invaders who came from the sea. They attacked cities all along the coast.
But we don't actually know who they were.
That's the mystery. Were they a single invading army, a confederation of tribes?
Mhm.
Or, and this is a really interesting idea, were they just refugees?
Refugees.
Yeah, think about it. Maybe they were people displaced by disasters happening elsewhere, hungry, desperate, and on the move. They might not have been the cause of their lapse, but a symptom of it.
A symptom that made everything much, much worse.
Absolutely. They turned a crisis into total chaos.
Which leads right into the second major factor, one that might have created those refugees in the first place. Climate change.
And this isn't just a theory anymore. We have hard scientific evidence from tree rings, from pollen analysis, lake sediments.
What does it show?
It shows a massive, prolonged drought that hit the whole eastern Mediterranean for over 100 years.
A century-long drought. I can't even imagine. That means crop failures.
Widespread crop failures. And that means famine. And famine is the ultimate destroyer of social order.
Because hungry people rebel.
Exactly. The palaces couldn't feed their people, their armies got weaker, and you have mass migrations of people just looking for food. People who might start to look a lot like those sea peoples.
So on top of drought and invaders, you have a third factor. The ground itself was shaking. Earthquakes.
Yeah, the whole region is a hotbed of seismic activity, and archaeologists can see the evidence.
How so?
In the layers of destruction at these ruined cities, you can see buildings that collapsed in a way that's typical of an earthquake, not of a fire or a battle. Whole walls just pancaked.
So you have famine, you have raiders attacking your coasts, and then your cities are literally falling down around you.
It's just one crisis compounding another. How do you even begin to recover from that?
You probably can't. Which brings us to the economic angle. Number 4. A breakdown in the most critical supply chain.
The tin shortage.
The tin shortage. It sounds so simple, but it was everything, wasn't it?
It was everything. Bronze defined their technology, their military, their agriculture. No tin, no bronze.
And we said earlier, the tin came from thousands of miles away. That trade route had to be incredibly fragile.
Very. So if those routes were disrupted by pirates, by collapsing kingdoms along the way, by general chaos, the supply just dries up.
I read a great analogy for this. It's like if our modern world suddenly ran out of oil tomorrow.
That's a perfect comparison. Everything just stops. Your armies can't make new weapons. Your farmers can't get new tools. The entire economic engine just seizes up.
So all of these external pressures, drought, invaders, earthquakes, resource shortages, they're all hammering this civilization. But the final factor, number 5, was an internal weakness.
Right. The problem was the structure of their societies itself, the fragility of the palace system.
What do you mean by that?
These societies were extremely centralized. The palace wasn't just where the king lived. It was the government, the treasury, the main warehouse, the granary.
It was everything.
It managed literally everything. The flow of food, trade, taxes, the army, it was all run from one central point.
So it was a massive single point of failure.
Precisely. There was no backup system, no redundancy. Once the palace fell, whether to an earthquake, a famine-driven revolt, or an attack, the entire social framework just disintegrated with it.
There's nothing left to hold society together.
Total chaos.
So when you put it all together, it's not that any one of these things could have destroyed them.
Probably not. They had survived droughts and earthquakes before, but they had never faced all 5 at the same time. The system was just too interconnected, too rigid, it couldn't adapt.
And the aftermath of this was a dark age.
A long one. For about 300 years in many places, civilization went backwards. Writing disappeared completely in Greece and Anatolia. Cities shrank into small villages. So much knowledge was just lost.
But something new eventually grew out of those ashes, right?
Always. History abhors a vacuum. From the ruins of the Mycenaeans, you eventually get the foundations of classical Greece. The world of Homer's epics is basically a folk memory of that lost, heroic age.
And there was a huge technological shift, too.
A critical one. People moved from bronze to iron.
Because you don't need tin for iron.
Exactly. Iron ore is much more common, much more locally available. So the small, scattered societies that survived could start to rebuild without relying on those huge, failed international trade networks. It was a more decentralized, resilient technology.
So why is this 3,000-year-old story so important for us to understand today? It feels uncomfortably relevant.
It is. It's a mirror. It shows us that complexity and interconnection are not the same as strength. The very things that made the Bronze Age world so successful were also the seeds of its destruction.
When you list the causes, climate change, supply chain collapse, mass migration, new forms of warfare.
It sounds strangely familiar, doesn't it? The lesson is that environmental stress can act as a threat multiplier, pushing already fragile political and economic systems past their breaking point.
The palaces didn't just fail, they amplified the failure across the whole system.
That's the key takeaway.
So I want to leave you, our listener, with a final thought to chew on. We live in the most globalized, interconnected system in human history. So think about it. Which of our modern systems, our food supply, our energy grids, the internet itself, rely too heavily on a single resource or a single point of control, just like those palaces relied on tin?
And if multiple global crises hit at once, a climate event, an economic crash, a pandemic, what are our backup systems? What's our iron?
The Bronze Age collapse teaches us that the time to build in resilience is long before the cracks start to show.
Because once they do, it can all fall apart faster than anyone can imagine.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. Keep exploring. Sometimes the most important lessons are buried in the ashes of worlds that came before us.
E é isso, pessoal! Espero que você tenha curtido o desafio de hoje e que esse mini podcast tenha ajudado você a treinar seu listening de um jeito simples e eficiente. Se você acertou todas as perguntas, parabéns! E se não acertou, não tem problema. O importante é continuar praticando e evoluindo um pouquinho a cada dia. Se você quiser mais exercícios como este, já deixa o like, se inscreve no canal e ativa o sininho para não perder os próximos vídeos. Obrigado por assistir e até a próxima!
E se você assistiu até aqui e quer aprender inglês sem gastar um centavo durante todo o processo de aprendizagem, com acesso a ferramentas, atalhos e mentoria que vai fazer com que você absorva o inglês de forma rápida e natural, eu te convido a conhecer o método dos 9 Passos para a Fluência, onde você vai conhecer a forma correta de aprender um inglês.
Good. Now we can go in the water.
Com acesso a ferramentas que irão te auxiliar nesse aprendizado. E o melhor, todas encontradas de forma gratuita. E entre essas ferramentas, uma você usará para manter contato com nativos do inglês para que sua prática de conversação seja mais eficaz. Porque nada melhor do que absorver o inglês diretamente da fonte. E quando eu digo que essas ferramentas são gratuitas, eu não quero dizer que apenas o primeiro mês será grátis, como degustação, e que se você quiser continuar usando, você terá que pagar. Todas as ferramentas que serão apresentadas a você nesse método são gratuitas para o resto da vida, até quando você quiser usar. Esse método é perfeito para você que não tem ideia de como e por onde começar e para você que já tem um conhecimento em inglês, mas ainda não conquistou a fluência. Nele você será apresentado a atalhos que vão acelerar seu aprendizado que estudantes que estão começando não fazem ideia que existem. 99% das pessoas que colocarem esse método em prática, seguindo passo a passo, conseguirão realizar seu sonho de se tornar fluente em inglês. Então, se você acha que finalmente chegou a hora de realizar seu sonho e dominar de vez o inglês, clique no primeiro link da descrição, que eu tenho certeza que você não vai se arrepender.